Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Janine and I love watercolor, and today I will show you how to paint an easy flower arrangement in pink. A full list of the materials I use is in the description. In a previous video, I showed you how to mix different shades of pink using 4 colors: permanent rose, ochre rose, cadmium yellow and cadmium orange. These are the colors I mixed with them. I really fell in love with this color palette, so I will use the colors for today's painting. Let's go over how I created the outline. I like to start by making a draft of the line drawing before I paint it on watercolor paper. Using the eraser too much on watercolor paper can damage the surface, leave marks or leave pencil residue. This especially applies to lower quality watercolor papers or any paper with a rough surface. I downloaded some beautiful photos as an inspiration. The flower that appealed most to me is the Stargazer lily. For the outline, I combined multiple different pictures. The easiest and quickest way to create a decent draft is to use thin paper. You can transfer the outline from a tablet to the paper. I find this easiest in the evening when it's dark outside, as it's just easier to see. Right now it is hard to see because there is still some sunlight coming through my closed curtains. In my original draft, there were some leaves at the top of the page. I decided not to include them in my watercolor painting as I find it clutters up the painting. This will also give me the space to add some splatters. Before I start painting, let me add something that you might already have noticed. The outline for today's video is a bit different from normal outlines. I added details which I normally would not include. For example, I added the veins in the center of the petals and leaves. I will draw in these lines later with a marker or a fine liner, so including them now in pencil just makes sense. In addition, limiting my watercolor palette will benefit the painting and make the black fine liner stand out even more. This style is something new for me, so I'm really excited to see the final result. Let's grab a large brush and start wetting the paper. This will allow the watercolor to flow freely to all the wet areas. I did not tape down the paper on all sides, because I only want to keep it in the frame of the camera. If you like the look of having straight white borders around your painting, you can of course totally tape it down and it will look amazing. Time to get painting. In step 1, I'm adding a first layer of watercolor to the paper. The watercolor is decently diluted with water. As I'm adding it to the wet paper, it will spread out pretty far, creating really soft edges in the process. I'm not using cotton paper today for this easy doodle. As we all know, wood pulp paper dries pretty fast compared to cotton paper. This is why I like to premix at least some watercolor. It will allow me to make full use of the wet in wet technique and allows the watercolor to spread out further on the wet paper. I test the colors in my brush on a spare sheet of paper. From now on, I make sure that there is enough watercolor in my brush and I just add the petals with as few brush strokes as possible. This will allow the watercolor to naturally flow and disperse on the paper. It is important to maintain as many color variations as possible to make the painting look more interesting and not flat. This is why I try to draw each petal with 2 strokes only. And the watercolor on my palette is not fully mixed, allowing for the color variation in my brush to be transferred onto the paper. I add less diluted paint to the center of the flower, adding to the color variation. For the leaves, I change the watercolor mix slightly by adding more yellow or orange. This will allow the eye to make a clear distinction immediately. Normally, I would try to not overwork the painting, but sometimes you need to help the watercolor to really flow and spread out on the wet paper. This is okay, as long as you use as few brush strokes as possible. The flower at the top of the page is shown from a side view. Don't let this throw you off. There are some hacks that can make it easier to paint it. First, keep in mind, leaving white space is great and adds to the color variation, especially at the top or the tip of the petals. Leaving white space for a clear distinction between the petals is a good thing. Second, remember that each petal will further be defined later on. The paper is a little drier at that time, so it will be easier. There is absolutely no need to add extra detail at this stage. And the same applies to the flower bud on the left. Working with wet wood pulp paper means that the paper will bulge and water and paint will pool in puddles. Taping it down would not help either. So I wash out my brush and dry it off and simply use it as a sponge to soak up the excess water. I love splatters. While the paper is still wet, I create splatters in all sizes. This adds so much interest to the painting. While I do that, I also go around and soak up any puddles that would disturb the watercolor from remaining where I put it. Thanks gravity. In step 2, I'm adding more watercolor, but the paper is already drier than before and the paint is less diluted. The watercolor will not bleed out as far as before. It intensifies the colors on the petals. This flower painting is in a pretty loose style. As I said before, larger color variations will make it look interesting. While I will not directly add shadows, I'm adding some more darker color to the shaded areas. Basically, it's just watercolor that's less diluted. It will make the painting look more three-dimensional. So as the paper dries, the watercolor does not naturally disperse as far anymore. I add some watercolor to the shaded areas, for example, the leaves under the flowers. A tip if everything fails. Let the painting dry completely and then wetten the whole paper to add the next layer. Just make it a second layer if you're having trouble getting the right dryness of the paper. Step 3 is easy. I add the black outline once everything is 100% dry. If your paper is too buckled to paint straight lines, you're always welcome to leave it under some books for a night to straighten it out. My pencil lines are still visible, but just to be sure, I pull up the reference picture on my tablet. Overall, this painting style is very forgiving. I will add the black lines after to define any edges of the flowers. If a pink leaf is out of place or the watercolor does not act the way I expected it to, don't worry about it. I tested multiple black pens and markers on watercolor paper that had some dry watercolor paint on it, and I must say that the outcome can vary. So I encourage you to test your pen as well before using it on your painting. This style was a first for me and I think I like the outcome. I hope you enjoyed it too. Please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and thanks for watching.